Welcome to 06880, the podcast. Tom Scarice, Westport superintendent of schools, his second appearance here. We chatted a few months ago on all things education.
We did.
Today we're going to talk about one thing only. It is a topic that's received a lot of attention nationally and locally: critical race theory. So let's start with CRT 101.
Yeah.
What is critical race theory?
Well, I am no expert in critical race theory. I haven't had a course on critical race theory. I don't know a person who's had a course on critical race theory. From everything that has been learned in public education over the past year or two, it's pretty clear that a theory was developed out of the legal scholarship community. So in the legal scholarship community, there were still some vexing problems that were being analyzed around discrepancies between how different demographics around race were having different outcomes. So whether if it was in policing, whether if it was in education, whether if it was in public health, there was a theory that was developed around that that pointed to really the bottom line that there's an intersection of race and U.S. law. And there was an analysis and a study of that, and it had been ongoing. And this goes back probably 40, 50 plus years ago. That theory had stayed in the legal scholarship community over years. It has become part of the educational discourse for some time now. But I think to keep it in my realm, in education, I'm going to bring it to just Connecticut, okay, for a second. When we talk about that the core of critical race theory in the legal community is around discrepancies in outcomes and race, and theories around laws, the question of whether or not laws play a role in that. In the education world, we have been chasing the dragon of gaps in performance of different subgroups of kids for a very long period of time. As a matter of fact, it is the seed that was planted in 2002 for the No Child Left Behind Federal Education Law Act. That was really at the cornerstone of it, was all about achievement gaps. So in the national education field, we've been talking about gaps and performance and outcomes and subgroups, and we talk about policy, we talk about resources, we talk about approaches to close those gaps. In Connecticut, it's really interesting because at the center of Connecticut is a landmark court case that happened in Hartford with the Hartford Public Schools in the early 90s, the Sheff versus O'Neill case, which was settled in the mid-90s. And coincidentally, I was a Sheff versus O'Neill middle school principal for a magnet school. So I'm very well versed in how that court case impacted education policy. And magnet schools were one of the three remedies that came out of that court case, which was intended to integrate and by integration close achievement gaps and distribute resources where maybe there were not in a region. So I was the principal of one of those schools for 3 years. It was an amazing experience. But in Connecticut, there has been a focal point because we do have some rather profound achievement gaps. And when I say achievement gaps, I mean performance on test scores. That's really what that is code for. Between students of color, between students at free and reduced lunch, poverty levels, and between students with special needs. So those subgroups primarily, among others, compared to other more dominant groups, the achievement gaps are there. So there are some parallel tracks between the legal history of CRT and what the education world has wrestled with around achievement for a very long period of time. So I can see how those have intersected and how those have become part of the discourse. Now, what seems to have happened today is the national conversation around race now has raised the CRT conversation to a whole different level with regards to public schools. So the technical and theoretical part of CRT is one thing. How it's playing out in public discourse, public schools, I'll say it, campaigns, probably campaign strategies on a national level, maybe even state or local, I don't know, is certainly I don't know if that's what the original legal scholar community was thinking. I'm not sure. And as I said, I'm not an expert in it. I've had no training in it. No teachers in Westport have been formally trained in critical race theory. I don't know any educators, and I've been in 6 different school districts that have been trained in this. But it has kind of, run amok at this point.
So the theory is that teachers and administrators are teaching this theory or trying to somehow bring it into the schools. Is that right?
Yeah. Well, I think you. There's a couple things going on right now. It's CRT, and again, these are my observations. I can certainly be corrected, and I could be wrong, but at this point, my experience observes, I guess, a proxy war around these issues that are playing out in the public schoolhouse. So there are conversations, debates going on around race, around access, around equity, around inclusion, and they're playing out in different spheres. You'll see it in private industry, no question. You'll see it in public venues, public institutions, schools. You'll see it in professional sports. You're seeing this discourse play out everywhere. In public schools, it's coming down to a few topics of what we teach, which, those culture wars also were around, Dan, I can remember back in the early 90s, when I was in college, those culture wars were rearing their heads. Tom Sobel, who was the commissioner of education in New York, he arrived with an agenda and was faced with the culture war of that time. So that has come in the forefront of education for some time. And you can go back all the way to the 50s and before Brown versus Board of Education. These topics are not new to public education as far as outcome disparity, okay, discrepancies, what's framed as disproportionality, okay? That's not new to public education. It's not new to have active debates around what we teach kids. That's not new either. Right now, there is a pretty hotly contested debate around how history is taught, around what text is used in classrooms. Is it one perspective? Are there multiple perspectives? So I can get to my thoughts on how I envision it being done well, but that's the core, I see it, of the debate right now, and probably around the idea of the debate of equity. I'm hearing folks talk about equitable opportunities versus equitable outcomes, and those kind of debates are taking place as well.
So how did this arrive in Westport, and why are we talking about it in Westport now?
So it's a loaded question of how CRT arrived, because there's a false presupposition that it is CRTs happening in our schools, but the debate and the discussion, my observation is that this is more of a national conversation that has started to permeate at very, very local levels. School board, school building, classroom, individual teacher, individual lesson levels. That's as granular as it gets in a school. An individual lesson, one day. You can't get more granular than that, okay? So I think that it has trickled down from a very national level. There are some interesting narratives that have been portrayed around the country. There's a lot of controversy in a set of private schools in New York City that kind of unfolded in the spring and the summer with some policy changes and so forth. And that sparked more traction in the national conversation, and they were used as examples. A lot of emotional appeals made people, I think, question what's happening in my kid's school, that very primal sense of, wait, what's happening to my kids? So I think that's how it has arrived in not just Westport, but in all communities around Connecticut.
So what is happening in Westport classrooms?
So it's interesting because we began, well, let me go back. When I started, I wasn't even on board yet. And there was a very active national conversation after the murder of George Floyd. Okay. So I was entering at that point, and there were statements from the Board of Education, the superintendent at the time, our interim superintendent, our board chair, around this conversation with race. There were requests from within and from outside. And one of the groups that had a request for an equity study was Team Westport, but they weren't the only ones. I want to just clarify that there were a lot of people, especially inside the system, that were asking. So that kind of kicked things off for us. We didn't really engage in that work until, after January, I believe, because of the pandemic, and no one in the system had ever conducted an equity study before.
And an equity study is?
Yeah. Well, actually, let me go back. An equity audit was what was first asked for, which I kind of coiled up at because I thought that, to me, a study begets an iterative process of questioning, getting some answers, leading to more questions and more learning, and ultimately just continuous improvement. So it may sound semantic, but I think it's really important to distinguish between getting a report on where you're good and bad and getting a study process that will lead to more inquiry and more questions and some answers. So the idea is around, as I frame it, around equitable access to programs and services. Okay, so that's the first. So I'm going to talk about three areas. Mm-hmm. Number one is equitable access to programs and services. Do we have open access for kids where appropriate, or do we have policies and practices? Maybe not overt policies, but practices, kind of quiet practices that may preclude a child who's ready to access certain courses, programs, and so forth. May it be because of a disability label? May it be because of achievement from a couple of years ago that maybe that gap has been closed, but it's closed off a pathway for them to pursue a course of study at the high school or the middle school. May it be that certain either genders, races, ethnicities, students' disabilities, may we notice a trend in the data that shows that there are certain groups impacted more than others? So you have an access question. The other question for me is a more broader but probably more critical question around a sense of belonging. So to what extent do our kids truly feel a real deep affiliation and connection and belonging in our schools? We have narratives that students have shared very openly and publicly around not feeling that way. And, do you ever get to a point that 100% every single student, every single adult feels a deep connection and affiliation? I don't know, but I do know you die trying. Mm-hmm. You make that a primary mission because nothing else can happen in a school to its optimal level if you don't have that sense of belonging and connection and affiliation. So belonging is the second. The third is around more of an overall futuristic look of preparation. So when kids are leaving our schools, when we talk about the equity study, and this is where we probably fell the shortest, this will be more of a curriculum evaluation, I believe, going forward. Do we have a program that truly prepares kids for an incredibly diverse world and a very, very global economy? Do we prepare them for citizenship, in the modern era? So those are three things that, were goals, access, belonging, and preparation. We got some interesting information, a lot of interesting ahas. There were days, for instance, that, we didn't really touch on subgroup demographic, race, ethnicity, and those kinds of things really terribly much because we were in a space talking about, what is the ecosystem of Westport right now? What has it been? How are we shaping kids? We talked about the pressure cooker environment that kids feel. That came up a great deal. So any good study will lead to some better, more refined questions and some answers. And I think that's where we ended up. So that's what started with the equity study. Okay. But that was a long-winded answer to your question. So go ahead.
So now that we've had the study,
mm-hmm.
What do we do?
So we're still in that phase. Okay. A couple things that happened. We had our final in-person meeting. Okay. And in that meeting, we started some action planning around three areas: around professional development for teachers, or around curriculum and instruction. How appropriate is the curriculum instruction program, preparing kids for the modern era, and then around data systems. Do we really have good information that we're collecting on kids to make good decisions and improve over time. So those are kind of three broad areas that we zeroed in on. There's more work to be done there. There will be a report that'll be produced at the end, at the culmination of all this work, and that'll be public. It'll go to the board, be public comment. It, again, is not intended to be an audit. It's intended to kind of look at where we are right now and what we could do next. The best thing that I would see coming of this is informing a long-term strategic plan for the district. Some elements of it, not the entire plan, because the plan is the whole system. But I certainly see it informing, certain parts of it in a powerful way. There were some interesting things that we learned and are still learning. So we'll go from there.
What did you learn? What struck you as?
I personally was struck by some of the narratives in the focus group work that was done in the spring from just personally, because I did similar work around May as well. And there were threads that were pretty consistent and common. Certainly questions from kids around, am I going to be ready for the modern world? Am I going to be ready to connect, relate, and work in a productive way with others? Am I going to be ready to be a professional, in the modern world? And what are we doing now to get me ready for that? Are we falling short of the mark? Are we hitting the mark? So that to me was really compelling. And I'm always interested in the affiliation that students feel towards school. Do they come in and feel that I'm known for who and what I am, not just some number? The other part I think that we started to uncover are the different tracks that students can follow through the high school, and to raise more questions about, are there ways to create greater access for kids when they're ready, and so forth. So I think those were all really good things for us to kind of dive into. We did look at data, and our data is limited. It's achievement data, state test data, some data from our local assessments, discipline data. And there were discrepancies as we interpreted it, but we interpreted it with our lens in that moment. So,
but I think education is more obviously than data, GPAs,
yes.
and I think this whole critical race theory debate comes back in some way to what is being taught and how it's being taught.
Yes.
And I sense that part of this debate in Westport is over the teaching itself, of how inclusive is it? What do you teach? How do you teach it?
Yeah.
And has that sort of opened up discussions with, in your circles?
Very, very timely. We're going through this process of getting ready for a 3 to 5 year long-term plan. A big part of that is going to be around teaching and learning. We're a school system. That's what we do. So it's going to be a big part of that. And this does raise those questions around two primary areas. What do we teach and how do we teach? Okay, so the what part is largely informed by national standards, state standards. We don't get to just kind of randomly pick things. There's a body of professional academic knowledge that we want to impart in any of the disciplines. On top of that, though, is layered what I think is even more important than academic knowledge. Academic knowledge to me is by itself, as an educational philosophy, insufficient. Necessary, but insufficient. If it's not enveloped by really sophisticated thinking skills, if we're not teaching kids how to think, the irony here is we're being asked a lot of critical questions about CRT. Don't we want to have our kids do that? It's like it's an interesting thing if you think about it, because that's what we're trying to impart to our kids is when you're confronted with something, are you asking really good questions? Are you breaking it apart? Are you analyzing? Are you able to evaluate it? So you have academic knowledge. We're still in the what realm of what we teach. You have, academic knowledge. It could be anything in the discipline of science, of math, of social studies, of language arts, whatever, of world language. And then you have this, whole enveloping of thinking skills and all those critical thinking skills that are so important. It's been probably 15, 20 years that we've been talking about as a profession that what only will take you so far in the global economy. It's what you can do with what you know and how you can think and how you can create. We've had landmark books come out. The new 7 survival skills, came out like probably 12, 14 years ago. It's all around thinking and collaboration and creativity. So that's the what. The how we teach is really, really interesting to me because the field is oversimplified. Okay. Dan's smart. Dan knows his content. Dan's a nice guy. Dan will be a great teacher. Maybe. I don't know. I mean, I know smart people who know architecture, but maybe are not a good architect. You have to have a professional practice. And that's what teachers, the very best teachers I know are voracious and are never done with their work. You just did a great spotlight, right, on Bobby from preschool, right?
Sure.
She's never done. She's still, and she won't teach the same way she taught 2-3 years ago because she's always trying to improve. So the how we teach is so important because what it does is it opens up access. So it's not just looking at students and saying what the students should be doing differently. That's part of the equation. But it's how could I instruct differently to open up access to all kids. So students with disabilities. Okay, it's a great one. Students who maybe were underserved. Students, of any kind of different demographic who maybe didn't get the same, type of instruction previously, or just have an achievement gap. So what we teach and how we teach. The what we teach around CRT that's coming into question the most is around the teaching of history, I believe. It's really in the humanities. I think it's that. I also think it's the books we read. I think those are the 2 areas that are coming into question. So we have a U.S. history textbook. Okay, that's a story, right? That's an accounting of history. There's scholarship that drives that, okay? But there's other sources, too, that are important, that have scholarship behind them, not just opinions, that have scholarship behind them. It's got to be a rigorous process to choose. We're going to bring in this alternative text. It's got to have scholarship backing it up. It can't just be someone's blog, okay? No offense to bloggers. So I think when you get into the what, we're teaching, say, around history, it can't just be one story. I don't think that's healthy, okay? But more importantly, teaching kids to interrogate what they're reading is the crux of this. That's the most important piece. You're going to give text. We want kids to interrogate it. Give them multiple texts. Interrogate them all. I don't believe we should present it as this is the one way, the only way, and now we're teaching kids what to think, not how to think. Okay, so I want to reverse that, and I think we do now. I think we do that in our schools now. I think schools all over do that. It's teaching kids how to think, not what to think.
I think one of the things that I've read about critical race theory is that people say it's teaching kids, it's indoctrinating. Mm-hmm. It's telling them that America's history is bad, that they should not be proud of their history, proud of their whiteness. Is that coming into play in Westport at all?
No, it's not. But I will tell you what we are guilty of as a profession. We're really guilty of this tyranny of either or, and we have a hard time embracing the beauty of and. You can be proud of your country and still confront the truths and realities. We have our own stories in our families, right? We love our families. None of our families are perfect. Okay, our nation's not perfect, but we can still be incredibly proud of the ideals we stand for, and know that we're composed of human beings with all of our strengths and all of our flaws that have done remarkable things and fell short of the mark other times. And we can have those conversations in classrooms. I think embracing both is really important for kids to be able to have accounting of history that truly has scholarship supporting it. Okay, not just someone's story about it, but truly has scholarship and primary source materials and so forth to look at things and really question. Wow, that must have been that's a little different than what I originally understood. And having that cerebral exercise to kind of go through and break it apart and analyze it and take on multiple perspectives. Why is that important? Because eventually, for some kids, not that far away, if you're in high school, you're sitting next to someone at work who has a totally different perspective. They may even look like you and dress like you and everything, but they may think very, very differently from you. Have you had an opportunity in your K-12 experience to wrestle with that, to wrestle with how do I confer with someone who thinks very differently from me? How do I take an alternative perspective? on things. In the classroom, our sandbox, in the classroom is really around the books we read, the ideas we talk about, the debates that we have, and it could be of a variety of subjects. It can't just be just history. But I feel an obligation to give kids that opportunity in their formative years where it's safe. And it ought to be safe in a classroom to have those conversations. Now, I think there's a fair criticism just to point out that some kids don't feel safe, with an alternative perspective. It could be, on one end of the spectrum or the other. And I do believe that happens. And I'm not just talking Westport. I'm talking anywhere. I mean, that's the reality of the world we live in, too. And one of the flaws, I think, of the modern world is then we go back to our social media echo chamber. So to get into a classroom where a very talented teacher can construct a lesson, an active conversation where ideas are being exchanged in civil ways, if we can't do that in schools, I'm kind of losing a little bit of hope for how we'll do it in greater society, because we know we're not doing very well there right now. Sure. So I think schools are a great place to do that, as long as the conditions are that we accept ideas, we are going to freely exchange ideas, and train kids, teach kids on how to do this.
From what you've seen, how well are the Westport schools doing that?
I think we have an incredibly, incredibly talented teaching team, very, very committed to developing kids. And I have to tell you, in my focus groups at the high school in particular, I'm embarrassed because I stereotyped the high school a bit. I came from a district that had about 1,000 kids in the high school, so it was much small, about half the size, and certainly an environment where we knew kids by name. And I will tell you, at Staples, to a kid in my focus groups, and I'm sure it's not the same experience for every kid, don't get me wrong, but those kids were like, no, these teachers here, they know us. Like when we start slipping off, we get a tap on the shoulders. We're walking out of class to be like, hey, I noticed the last few days you're not up to speed here. What's going on? So there's the professional expertise, but then there's that commitment to kids. And listen, just like every police department, every law firm, any other organization of people, there are those that are performing at different levels. And, I don't want to whitewash this, but I think overall there's a commitment to development and caring for kids that's pretty profound. And when it comes to your question around their skill set in doing this kind of work, I think it's a very strong skill set, but we're never done learning. That's really critical, is that as educators, we are in the field of learning and we value continuous learning as a result of that.
So I guess the last question is, as we look ahead, what's, as we look to the district, what do we need to do, continue doing well? What do we need to do differently or better? What's out there that we may not be quite aware of yet?
Yeah.
What's the next few years going to look like for the district educationally?
I'll start really big picture. My own personal, this is an opinion. Okay. I have, just my own opinion based on my observations and what I've read. I believe this culture war, this debate, this national debate, is really pointing towards next November's midterm congressional elections. So I really think the temperature in the room is going to still be a little high until then, at the earliest. I just think it's part of an ongoing debate nationally. It's happening. What is a little different is that, and it could have something to do with the modern era of technology and social media, the national debate is trickling into the state and local arenas, in my experience in 25, 26 years, in a different way, in a much more concrete, specific way. So I think that we will be confronted with this conversation for the foreseeable future. And as far as, what we can do as a system, a couple things. I think that a high priority for me is communication. So I try to do, that's why I'm here today. I try to do my best to communicate, and I could talk on certain topics like this for a very long time. But I try to communicate in ways to be very clear and open and transparent, but also to reassure, that things are out in the open here. And our primary objective is to care for your child and to make sure they're ready for citizenship and the world of work when they leave our schools and higher ed and so forth. So communications, number one, to be a big thing. Number two, we're never done with our work of always trying to improve our instruction, how we teach. We're never done with, ways that we can get kids to feel more a part of the fabric of a school community, to feel that belonging. You're never done. Even if you have surveys that say, oh, every kid, you're never done. You keep doing it. It's a daily thing you do. It's not like, you want to, you don't brush your teeth once for an hour, okay, and then think you're good for the year, okay? You don't work out once for, 5 hours and then you're done. It's constant, never-ending work, in schools around belonging and around improving our instruction. I look forward to that professional development part of those kind of conversations that I articulated before, to have discourse and to have teachers who are comfortable because they have a repertoire to frame a very active discussion, and kids leave the room exchanging ideas civilly and freely. I think that's such a gift to give our kids in this era, to go off into the world and be able to do that, because they have awful role models right now. They may be the role models if we do it right.
Great. Anything I should have asked that I did not?
No, I think I filled plenty of airspace today. Thank you.
Well, it's always a pleasure, Tom, to talk with you. Westport Superintendent of Schools, Tom Scarice, talking about critical race theory and the Westport school system and the 21st century.
Appreciate it. Thank you.